Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Gameweek 30 Draft wildcard, and the wildcard, in my opinion, is an interesting strategy to think about now because, of course, we've just come out of Gameweek 29, a horrible Gameweek 29. But what's nice about Gameweek 30 wildcard is you can suddenly just jump onto a bunch of players that are completely irrelevant and completely different from the team that you've sort of carried all the way to Gameweek 29. If you're someone who, let's say, didn't free hit on Gameweek 29, you can treat this almost, or you can treat Gameweek 29 as effectively your dead end. And if you're, let's say, someone who has been, navigating with the free at 29 and you don't like the look of your team, Gameweek 30 is a potential wildcard destination. I do think that ultimately it's either a Gameweek 30 wildcard, a 31 wildcard, or a 35 wildcard. A 35 wildcard is probably more along the lines of players who've actually planned for free at 29. So if you played free at 29, it's a little bit easier for you to dead end into Gameweek 34 and therefore go for a wildcard on 35 and actually delay it so that you can basically create the best bench boost possible. The alternative is that you plan right now for something like a Gameweek 30 wildcard or a Gameweek 31 wildcard. And the reason why you might be considering between the two is because of whether your defense actually looks good for this week, which I think a lot of people have bad defenses. This gives you a chance, if you wildcard now, to immediately rectify the defense. If you actually have a good defense and you, let's say, have a lot of Spurs players, then actually you have less reason to wildcard in Gameweek 30. You could actually hold 1 week and go for a Gameweek 31 wildcard instead. I think that's an option. And it comes down to whether, for example, you ask yourself whether you have Salah and Palmer in your team already, whether you're actually happy to go with triple Spurs because they have a brilliant fixture in Luton at home, or whether, of course, your defense is going to move you towards a Gameweek 30 or 31. I think it's very close. That these are marginal calls, but the wildcards will be conceptually similar whether you're on 30 or 31. The first wildcard that I want to mention, and because there are two variants of the wildcard for this video, is first of all a wildcard with a free hit 34 in mind. I'm going to assume that most of us will bench boost on 37, but I don't think that's going to substantially change your draft. As you guys know, I like deeper drafts. We also have a lot of options right now in the FPL landscape, and I think that it's best that we use them. This draft, of course, as I said, is going to be free at 34. The second draft variation is no free hit remaining. So free at 29ers, basically. So Gameweek 30 wildcard, what are the goalkeepers that we want to go for? In my opinion, it's Petrovic and Raya. The reason why we want to go for this is because Raya is going to double in Gameweek 34. Petrovic is going to double in Gameweek 37. Now, of course, this depends on whether you think Petrovic will keep his spot in the team. And in my opinion, we've already seen Sanchez play within the cup. I think Petrovic has played really well within the league this season. I think he'll stay number one for this Chelsea team. And I'm not too concerned about Petrovic and his spot within the team. So I would really like Petrovic within this draft here. As far as Raya, once again, he's been brilliant this season. Arsenal have been a brilliant defense. Yes, of course, you might miss out on the attacking returns of White or Saliba, but this allows you to navigate the landscape a little bit better. And of course, when it comes to, let's say, Gameweek 37, you can probably still create a much more well-rounded team and a stronger bench boost by going for Raya instead of, let's say, Saliba. And then in the defense, what we'll have is Gusto. Gusto is someone that I think is a little bit debatable. Some people think that Reece James is going to come back soon. And even though, of course, yes, he's been pictured, in terms of rehab and is close to coming back per se, I just think that you have to think about what the story has been for Reece James so far for the last 2 seasons. He's been struggling to get back onto the field, and whenever he's come back onto the field, he hasn't been able to complete 3 to 4 fixtures in a row for the last 2 seasons. So there's clearly something wrong in terms of rushing him back to football. What Chelsea have tried this season is they've tried to take it as slow as possible, and even that hasn't worked out. So when he was actually coming back, we saw 15-minute stints, 30-minute stints, and basically, resting him for basically 1 match at a time so that he could play every other match. And unfortunately, he's still found his way to get injured. On the flip side, we've also had Gusto, who's played all season as a deputy, and he's actually played brilliant. In fact, I'd probably still say right now he's probably Chelsea's second or third best player, and he's been brilliant in the last few fixtures. His minutes have been on an uptick, so as opposed to, let's say, being a 78-minute substitution, 75-minute substitution, or committing very dangerous tackles, we've seen Gusto play really, really well for the Chelsea team. So in my opinion, his team and his position in the team is safe for this season, and hopefully until Gameweek 37. I also think that there's enough upside for Gusto as an attacking fullback where you can just generally consider that he's maybe worth a -4 down the line, even if, let's say, James is suddenly going to take all the minutes away from Gameweek 37, which I think is very, very unlikely right now. We also have some Chelsea doubles around Gameweek 35 and 36, so the sooner you have more Gusto game weeks, the better. And I think that he's going to keep his position in the team, and I think we'll see very, very intermittent levels of sort of James' involvement. So that's why I'm going for Gusto. Udogie is someone who's just cheaper than Porro. We know that Spurs have a lot of fixtures. The beauty of going for a free at 34 here is that you can circumnavigate the blank that Tottenham have on Gameweek 34. So you don't actually care about the blank at all. This is why this draft features 3 Tottenham players. So that's the option. Udogi for me, I go for because he's cheaper. And Guardiola is an option that I think is interesting because for me, he's more of a 0 to 90 minute player. Now, if you don't like Guardiola, I think you can simply replace Guardiola with another defender. Potentially, it would be, let's say, if you go for another Chelsea defender, you could, of course, replace Petrovic. Let's say you have more money in the bank. I would maybe stretch towards Diaz. But I like Guardiola because I think when he's fit, he's someone who's actually more nailed than most. The issue, of course, is going to be whether he prioritizes Champions League fixtures or Premier League fixtures for Guardiola. And if we've seen, of course, that Guardiola might find his way on the bench on certain tactical bases. I do think that the Guardiola pick is still strong. I do think that the alternative is potentially just a Newcastle defender. A Newcastle defender for Guardiola can be helpful because that Newcastle defender could be more nailed than Guardiola. There are players who, of course, have a season ended. For example, Botman has his season ended. If you need more money in the bank, Lascelles could be your option that you can basically keep as your 5th defender for the time being, and he can serve you quite well. You also completely ignore Gameweek 34 because you'll be free hitting. So that is another option as well for Gameweek 30. There are other alternative options, like let's say a Man United defender. So for example, Dalot can be quite interesting to you at a similar price point. But I think the issue with Dalot, of course, is that a lot of his value comes down to Gameweek 34, where he himself faces Sheffield United at home. The alternative would be maybe, let's say, just simply going for a Brighton defender, because Brighton, of course, will have a lot of fixtures left. They'll also have a double, but unfortunately, that double isn't very good on Gameweek 37 anyway. So I don't really like going for a defender necessarily. It could be Dunk, of course. Estupiñán is a little bit doubtful. Van Heck, I think, also has sort of locked down his position in the team. So it comes down to whether you want to save money. I think Van Heck, once again, representative of another player like Lascelles, who's going to be useful for Gameweek 37. Not necessarily useful in the short term, but still a good pick all the same, ultimately as a 5th defender. So that's your alternative for Guardiola. And your sort of key defenders, of course, are going to be Virgil and Gabriel. Because even though, once again, you probably could go for Virgil and Gabriel in Gameweek 34, the reality is you're investing into these top teams again. And within Liverpool and Arsenal, you still have probably the best picks left within the game. They have good short-term fixtures. Virgil, for example, Sheffield United at home next week. Gabriel going forward, after this fixture, where you have basically fixtures like Luton at home, so on and so forth. No reason to basically move out of these Liverpool and Arsenal players, even though they actually have a double that you'd cover with a free hit. And then in the midfield, we're going with the tried and trusted Salah, Son, and Palmer. I don't think we really need to discuss them. Sarabia, once again, a lot of people will be raising their hands as to why we have someone like Sarabia, who's probably only useful for Gameweek 34 free hit. But in my opinion, I think you just have to look at the fixtures that Wolves actually have. They have one of the most insane fixture schedules in the short term. So the fixtures heading up towards that Gameweek 34 are Aston Villa, which of course is a tough game. But then actually you've got Burnley away, West Ham at home, Nottingham Forest away, and after the double, you've got Luton at home. So those games in isolation are incredible. Even on Gameweek 37, for example, as a single gameweek fixture, if you still have somehow Sarabia within your team, you're still staring at Crystal Palace at home, which is a very, very good fixture as a home fixture and a good single gameweek fixture as well. So I quite like Sarabia. He's also at 4.7. So you're looking for options here who actually allow you to navigate a Salah, Son, Palmer, Haaland draft, and he is one of those picks. Richarlison is the last pick within this draft. I think Richarlison is probably a contentious pick, but the key thing here is whether you have confidence in his minutes overall and whether you think he will continue to start games in the future for the Spurs team. We've already seen that Werner, Johnson, and Kulusevski will occupy other positions in the field, so the attack is already quite stacked in terms of the amount of depth that they have. Even Maddison, for example, can be an early substitution. So that is a bit of a concern with Richarlison, but I think we always know that Richarlison is a very strong pick, particularly if he can ever play centre forward. And if you have confidence that Richarlison starts, I think he's the pick to go for on a Gameweek 30 wildcard, which plans for a free at 34. Now, if you don't like Richarlison for whatever reason, I do think that the best alternative is going to be Garnacho, because Garnacho for me, it was once again one of those players who you can play on every other week because Man United still have good fixtures, and he's going to double game week on 37, so he's going to be one of the better picks there. And if you have more money in the bank, you can start to consider, of course, upgrading some other options. Like you can go for something like Virgil to Trent later down the line, but I think that's completely excessive. But there are not too many options outside of maybe Luis Diaz that I'd really consider in the short term. And unfortunately, you're planning still for, let's say, a free at 34. So in terms of the best players for 37 that actually have a really good fixture within the midfield, I think you're kind of looking at players like, once again, a Maddison potentially. If you can actually afford to keep Maddison in your team, he's potentially lower ceiling than Richarlison, but definitely higher floor. And later down the line, of course, Richarlison can just simply be a Foden as well if you have no confidence in Richarlison as a pick. But I think when we go down to, let's say, 37, Garnacho is going to be a brilliant pick. So if you need to save money, you go for Garnacho. You could also be considering someone like Pascal Gross as well, just the same way that, for example, Gordon is a Newcastle pick that is sort of representative of that replacement for Guardiola if you don't like Guardiola as an option. So Gross and Gordon are sitting there, but of course you have other doublers like Bruno and Rashford who are a little bit more expensive right now. I think Richarlison's a happy medium where I still think that he's going to start, which is why I'm pretty confident in him as a pick. But if you're not confident in Richarlison, I think it's totally fine to skip out on him and go for instead a Maddison if you can actually afford Maddison, or simply just go for Garnacho if you want to save money. So those for me are the two best options. You can go for Foden later down the line, say Gameweek 33. So that's going to be the midfield. And then in the attack, we're actually going to be going for Haaland, Muniz, and Isak. I like Haaland a lot because ultimately, you're trying to create a bench boost for 37. Going without Haaland on a Gameweek 30 wildcard, even though you're going for, let's say, a structure here or let's say fixtures in the short term that aren't perfect for Haaland, there's no reason to sort of break your team apart. Go for let's say, go for players like Trent, Isaac, Darwin as well, and sort of ignore Haaland. Because you've got this 34th free hit, I think it just makes sense to start with Haaland. I would start most structures with Haaland and Salah, and part of this is because we just have enough depth and enough key players at cheap price points that actually allow you for a Haaland draft. Then we've got Muniz, and Muniz is basically one of those options that I mentioned, just like Garnacho, who plugs in holes. Muniz is like a budget Watkins to me. So you're sort of replacing Watkins, yes, of course, but I think we're all planning to draft a Gameweek 30 wildcard without Watkins because, yes, he has a good fixture on 30. Yes, he has a good fixture technically on 32 as well. But you really want to be going without Watkins because there are other players who will double. Isaac will double, or Isak will double rather. You can go for other players like Gordon later down the line. You can go for players like Maddison later down the line if you don't like Richarlison, or of course you just have players like Foden, Fernandes, etc., etc. These are the sorts of players that I think are very, very strong, and Isak actually just has brilliant fixtures in the short term. So this Newcastle team are really worth investing into, and this is probably the only position where I'd consider doing so because, yes, of course, whilst you lose Darwin for Gameweek 31, actually, Isak is probably still going to trump Darwin when you consider that Gameweek 34 is going to be chalked off as a fixture for free at 34. So that's why I really like Muniz. And for me, I think Muniz will keep his position in the team. We've seen enough to see that he's a brilliant player. I think that the question marks are still remaining in terms of whether he's a penalty taker. But in the short term, I just think he has so much value. And ultimately, he's probably the 14th, 15th man within your team. And a player that good is definitely worth considering, given that he actually allows you to create such a well-rounded draft. And then actually in terms of the second draft variant, we're going to be going with Gameweek 30 wildcard here, no free hit plan. The second wildcard draft here is going to be the Gameweek 30 wildcard draft where you don't go for a free hit planned. No differences here in terms of Ryan Petrovic. You cover Gameweek 34 and 37 perfectly. With Gusto and Udogi, you're basically looking at players who just have really good short-term fixtures. We don't have a triple up of Spurs here. That's the big difference within the drafts. Spurs ultimately have a lot of fixtures in the short term, but I think it also makes more sense to be able to navigate Gameweek 30 better. So that's why we've gone for Virgil van Dijk over someone like a Pedro Porro. Yes, of course, you'd love to play Pedro Porro versus Luton Town at home, but I think it does make sense as long as you've got Gusto versus Burnley, Udogi versus Luton Town at home, and actually Virgil van Dijk versus Crystal Palace, that you actually have a really competent team for this week. And then Ruben, and then actually Munoz and Gabriel, you can just bench. Munoz is more of a better option. I just watched him play actually live versus Spain, scored versus us as well, but that's not why we picked him. We picked him because he's a Crystal Palace doubler, and we're pretty confident in what he can provide, as a double-ended defender. So very good defender, 1v1. That doesn't get you FPL points, but the clean sheets that Crystal Palace could potentially get in Gameweek 34 will. And on the other side, we also see that he's a very capable attacker, someone who's very willing to commit on the overlap for this Colombia team and also this Crystal Palace team. So that's going to be the defenders. And the reason why we're skipping out on a Man City defender, because I think ultimately, if you're sort of thinking about it, we can plan for Gameweek 37 right now with a Man City defender. You can also plan for maybe potential, let's say, Newcastle defenders as well. But I think right now, I'd still much rather go for the short-term expected value and get players like your doublers from Munoz than, let's say, plan for a 37 bench boost that's elite, right? I think part of the strategy that you have to understand with, let's say, having no free hits is that you want to make sure that your team is balanced all the way through as opposed to catering towards Gameweek 37 entirely. In the midfield, we have a very similar team. It's Salah, Son, Palmer, Sarabia, Garnacho. The reason why we're going with Garnacho here and saving money as opposed to, let's say, going for a Richarlison instead is because ultimately you can't carry those that many Spurs players. A lot of the Spurs players will have to be transfers out. It's tough to keep these Spurs players. Garnacho fulfills his role as someone who has a really good fixture in Gameweek 34 and also a really good fixture in Gameweek 37. As far as Haaland, Solanke, and Darwin, once again, Solanke is brilliant because of the Gameweek 34 fixture, and so is Darwin. So as opposed to, let's say, Isaac and Muniz from the previous draft, you're now looking at players who will actually give you as much value as possible in the short term in Gameweek 34, and then you can actually plan potentially more transfers towards Gameweek 37 later than a Gameweek 37 manager would if they had a free at 34 in the short term right now. So the big difference here, of course, is actually more so within the attacking positions. We want a little bit more of a balance because Garnacho still has a really good Gameweek 34 fixture. Yes, of course, you could consider Eze later down the line. I think Son to Eze could still be a really good transfer here. But I actually really like going for Solanke and Darwin because it makes you have a really strong, robust team in the short term, particularly for Gameweek 34. And that's the big difference between the two drafts. So that's it really for the wildcard drafts this week. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoy the video, and I'll see you guys soon. Take care and bye.